Merhabalar. Bundan sonraki session'ımızda VMRay teknolojiden Rohan Viegas, kendisi Product Manager. The Invisible Malware Sandbox VMRay Analyzer konusundaki sunumunu gerçekleştiriyor olacak. Rohan, please take the stage.
Okay, well, thank you. My name is Rohan Viegas, and I am a product manager at VMRay. If you haven't heard about VMRay, we are a threat analysis and detection company based in Germany. So today I will be talking to you about, can I flick through the slides as well? Thank you. Okay, so I want to talk to you today about sandboxing, malware sandboxing, what it is. So I'll spend a little time. I assume many of you are familiar with the concept of malware sandboxes already, but I'll spend some time talking about what it is. I then want to talk about use cases, right? So where you would typically use a malware sandbox, which teams inside an organization use a malware sandbox, and how they use it. And then I want to focus on some challenges with traditional malware sandboxes. So there are many companies, many products available today which offer sandboxing. I want to talk about the challenges associated with traditional approaches, and then introduce you to our approach to sandboxing, which is very unique, very different from the existing sandboxing approaches. And then we will look at some benefits associated with this approach. Okay, so let's begin. So malware sandboxing, right? What is it? Malware sandboxing is sometimes called automated malware analysis, sometimes referred to as dynamic analysis. What it is essentially is basically the execution of a file or a URL inside a controlled environment, right? So when you do this, you monitor the behavior of that file or that URL inside the controlled environment, and you generate an analysis result. Now, based on this analysis result, you can make a determination if the file is malicious or not. Now, this is a much more effective approach to traditional signature-based detection systems, because in this approach, you are basically looking at the behavior of the file, right? So this is a behavioral approach to detecting if a file is malicious or not. So typically, as an example, let's say you receive a phishing email which has a Word document attached to it, right? You can take this attachment, submit it to your malware sandbox. It will then be executed inside or detonated inside the malware sandbox, and you can see everything that this file is trying to do, right? So is this file trying to contact a remote host? Is this file trying to change some registry keys on the system? Everything will then be provided in the analysis result, and you can make a determination if the file is good or bad. So this is what malware sandboxing is, and as I mentioned, there are many approaches to malware sandboxing. Let's now talk about the use cases, right? So how do you use a sandbox? Where do you use a sandbox? Who uses a sandbox? The first use case is protection. So every organization has a security operations center or a SOC team. This team would use a sandbox in order to make sure that the organization is safe from threats, right? So typically, this team is looking at alerts generated by a number of security products, and obviously one of the alerts will be from this malware sandbox when it detects a malicious file. So in terms of the requirements for this team, right? What is it that this team requires? It requires a sandbox that can detect zero-day malware. It requires a sandbox that can detect targeted malware. It requires a sandbox that can detect evasive malware. So the detection efficacy of the sandbox is very important for this team. The second team or the second use case for a sandbox is incident response, right? So if your organization is breached by malware, you have a very dedicated team called the incident response team that is responding to the incident. So this team is trying to limit the damage that's caused by the malware, and it's also trying to prevent this damage occurring in the future again. So what are the requirements for this team from a malware sandbox? They require a malware sandbox to provide clear analysis results. They require the malware sandbox to provide actionable results. Now, for this team, time is very important. If your organization has been attacked, this team needs to respond as quickly as possible. So it wants quick results, it wants clean results so that they don't have to spend too much time sifting through the results. And so that is the requirement for this specific use case. And then the third use case is the generation of threat intelligence, right? So in addition to having a SOC or Security Operations Center and an incident response team, every organization also needs to have threat intelligence which is maintained and kept up to date. Many organizations, they buy threat intelligence from different companies, from different threat intelligence vendors, but a number of organizations today are using sandboxes to generate threat intelligence. And then they use this threat intelligence for protection and for incident response. So these are the main use cases of a sandbox, and this is where every organization would deploy a sandbox, right? Now let's talk about some of the challenges with traditional malware sandboxes. Now, as I said, there are many sandbox products out there, right? All of you have heard of the FireEyes, the LastLines, the Fortinets, and so on. What are the challenges associated with traditional malware sandboxing approaches? At a high level, there are two traditional approaches to sandboxing, and so we look at those two approaches, right? The first challenge associated with the sandbox is evasive malware. Imagine this is your analysis environment, or this is your sandbox here, right? You have malware that you want to analyze and detect if it is malware. Many traditional approaches, they put a sandbox agent inside the analysis environment. Now, this sandbox agent can be, some sort of hook inside the operating system. There are many ways to do this, but at a high level, they introduce a sandbox agent, and the job of this sandbox agent is to monitor the behavior of the malware, see everything that it does, and then tell you, is this file good or is this file bad? The problem with this approach is that the malware can detect the sandbox. And when malware detects that it is inside an analysis environment and not in a user system, the malware simply behaves benign. The malware does not do anything malicious, and this sandbox cannot detect this malware. So this is a very, very big challenge associated with traditional malware sandboxes. What is the impact of this? The impact of this is if you have an evasive zero-day malware that attacks your organization, the chances are, if you are using a traditional malware sandbox, it will evade the sandbox and your organization will not be safe from this evasive malware. So this is the first challenge. Let's talk about the second challenge. The second challenge is false positives. Now, when you have a security operations team, this team is facing or getting a lot of alerts, a lot of notifications. You don't want this team to receive unnecessary notifications, right? False positives. They will distract this team, they will waste time, and time is obviously important for this team. So we did a very simple experiment, right? We took 3 commercial sandboxes, which are freely available as well, and we submitted a Word document, Microsoft Word document, which was completely blank, right? An absolutely benign Word document was submitted to 3 sandboxes. Now you would expect that the sandboxes would tell you, this is a clean file, no problem, this is a clean file, please move on. But we saw very different results. Sandbox 1 told us for this blank, clean Word document, they recorded 7,000 API calls and 700 indicators of compromise, right? Sandbox 2 said there was some information stealing happening. It said there was some code injection happening. That's always something bad. And Sandbox 3 said, again, there's some evasion going on here, some code injection going on here. Now, clearly, this was a blank Word document, right? But these 3 sandboxes are telling us that something bad is happening here. Now, the point I want to make is that many sandboxes will generate false positives because they are tuned to do things like this. With our approach to sandboxing, when you submit a blank Word document, you get what you expect to see. No result. The document is clean, right? And so this helps reduce the number of false positives. So your security team is not going to be tired of dealing with so many alerts, and many of which are unnecessary alerts, right? So this is something that's very important to every security team, and it is a challenge with traditional sandboxes. Let's look at the next challenge, right? Now, every sandbox is trying to detect malicious behavior of a sample, right? But the challenge with traditional malware sandboxes is that in addition to tracking all of the malicious things that a file or a URL does, it also tracks a lot of benign operations, right? So for example, if you receive an email with a malicious Word document attachment, and if you submit the Word document attachment to your sandbox for analysis, the sandbox will record everything that the Word document does, but it will also record benign things that Microsoft Word is trying to do. So it's not just recording the bad stuff, it's also recording some benign stuff. What is the problem with that? The problem is that the log files or the reports which are to be used by the security team, they have a lot of unnecessary noisy output. So the security team is only interested in this malware behavior, but the traditional malware sandboxes are generating an output that has not just the malware behavior, but also things like side effects of the operating system, side effects of the application, and so on. And so if you give this log file to your security team has to read all of this to get to the important information, right? So imagine how much time and effort is wasted when you do this sort of a traditional malware sandboxing. So noisy output is very, very important, especially for incident response, right? Your incident response team wants to respond very fast, very quickly. They should not get reports like this. They should get clean, noise-free reports. And then the last point I want to make here is precision, right? Your sandbox should be able to monitor malware at different levels of granularity. So if you want very high level overview, you should be able to get it. If you want a very detailed overview of the behavior of the sample, you should be able to do it as well. With most traditional malware sandboxing technologies, you cannot automatically adjust the level at which you monitor the sample, right? So they lack precision. And then the last point I want to make, and many of you may be familiar with this, is the high cost associated with sandboxing. So particularly if you use emulation-based sandboxes, they are very performance intensive. They are not designed to manage very large loads. So for example, you can submit a few files and you will see good results. But if you start sending all of the emails in your organization to the sandbox, it is not very scalable. And in order to scale, you then need to invest a lot of money. And over time, this becomes unsustainable, right? So you want a sandboxing solution that you can scale, but at the same time, maintain a low total cost of ownership. And this is a very big challenge with traditional malware sandboxes. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a third approach to sandboxing, which is what we call an agentless approach to sandboxing or a hypervisor-based approach to sandboxing. Now, the first thing you will notice is the key difference in the technology underlining this approach. So if you remember the example, this is your analysis environment, and this is your malware. Instead of having an agent inside the analysis environment, you now have monitoring from outside the analysis environment, right? The advantage of this approach is that malware now cannot detect the sandbox. So if you have evasive malware that is checking, am I inside a sandbox or am I on a user system, it will not be able to tell that it is inside a sandbox in this technology approach. Right? So this is the first advantage or the first challenge that has now been addressed. Right? So the result is evasion resistance and what we call an agentless approach or a hypervisor-based approach to sandboxing. The second advantage is basically the ability to automatically adjust the level of monitoring, right? So do you want to see what the malware is doing at a high level? Do you want to see details of what the malware is doing at the operating system level? Being able to adjust that monitoring granularity gives you precise, noise-free analysis reports. Your incident response teams, your security teams will look at these reports and tell you, this has saved so much time for me. So this is very, very important. The other output is that you get threat intelligence that is actionable, right? So if someone is asking you for threat intelligence, and if you give them threat intelligence from a traditional sandbox, that threat intelligence has a lot of noise in it. But if you have this approach to sandboxing, you generate threat intelligence that is clean, that is actionable, and that can be used directly. So that's the second challenge that has been addressed. And then the last challenge was that of scalability and total cost of ownership. Now, this whole approach is based on virtualization, right? With the exception that, of course, the monitoring takes place at the hypervisor layer. So because it uses a virtualization system as its base, it is basically very scalable. So you will have no challenges when you want to scale up and submit a very large number of files or URLs for analysis. So, this approach to sandboxing is what forms the basis of our product, VMRay Analyzer, and these are the advantages or the challenges that it helps address. So, I deliberately left this table blank, but if you are looking to buy a malware sandbox, if you are looking to invest money in malware sandboxing, you need to consider these 5 points here, right? Understand what your team requires. Is evasion resistance your most important requirement, right? Is your organization facing zero-day malware on a regular basis? If it is, then maybe evasion resistance is most important for you. If your security team has many security products sending it notifications, then you want your sandbox to not generate any false positives. So this becomes more important for you. If you have incident response teams that are constantly responding to attacks by malware, you want to generate reports that are clean and noise-free. And so on for high precision, and obviously scalability and cost is a problem for pretty much every team. So you want to look at all of these points and then make a decision. If I want to buy a sandbox, a traditional sandbox that's based on emulation technology, or a traditional sandbox that's based on the agent-based approach that we talked about, where you have the agent inside the analysis environment. Sometimes it's also called the hooking-based approach. Or if you want to have this agentless approach or hypervisor-based approach to sandboxing. So with that, I'll wrap up by closing about VMRay. So we are a company that does malware sandboxing using this unique approach that I talked about. We are based in Germany. Our R&D team is based in Germany. We also have a sales and marketing team based in Boston. Now, one last point I want to make is that the two founders of VMRay, both of them have a great deal of experience with malware sandboxing. In fact, Carsten Willems comes from the world of agent-based sandboxing, and our other founder, Ralph Hund, comes from the world of emulation-based sandboxing. So they understand the challenges of these traditional approaches, and they have then come together and created this new approach to sandboxing. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. I can take any questions if there's time.
Can you please specify how exactly you monitor the sandbox environment without an agent? Are you listening to the traffic? Does the product listen to this traffic?
Okay, so it's a very detailed answer, but I'll give you a high-level answer. We also have a white paper that's available on our website if you're more interested. But basically, it's a virtualized system, right? So every analysis is running inside a virtual machine, but the monitoring is at the hypervisor layer. So from the hypervisor layer, we access the virtual machine using a number of Intel CPU features, for example, and a number of memory mapping mechanisms. But we have the ability from the hypervisor to actually look into the virtual machine without having to place an agent inside the virtual machine. Okay. And like I said, for details, you can always visit our website and look at the white paper. All right, if there are no more questions, well, thank you for your time.